The morning the town of Ash Ridge decided what Eliza Moreland was worth, the sky refused to cooperate with the occasion. It was the kind of flat, white-hot morning where the dust didn't settle so much as hang in the air, like it was waiting to see what would happen too. She stood on a wooden platform that had been built for selling cattle and grain sacks, not people, though nobody in the crowd seemed bothered by that particular detail. Her hands were folded in front of her, knuckles pale, because if she unfolded them, she was afraid they'd start shaking, and she wasn't going to give this town the satisfaction of watching her shake. $50, her father called out, the way another man might call out the price of a mule. She cooks. She sews. She don't talk back much. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Not cruel exactly. Worse than cruel. Bored. Like this was just another Tuesday and she was just another transaction standing between them and their lunch. Eliza kept her eyes on a spot above everyone's heads, on the faded lettering of the feed store sign across the street. She had practiced this. Looking at nothing. Becoming nothing, for just long enough to survive being looked at by everyone. Barren, her father added, like it was a selling point gone wrong instead of the cruelest word he could have chosen. 4 years married, no children. Husband's dead now anyway, God rest him, so she's free and clear. $50. Nobody bid. Her father's voice cracked a little on the second try. 45. Still nothing. A man near the front spit tobacco into the dirt like that was his answer. 40. The silence stretched out long enough that Eliza could hear her own pulse in her ears. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways in the weeks since her husband's funeral, since her father had sat her down at the kitchen table and explained, in the flat voice he used for things he didn't want to feel, that he couldn't keep feeding a grown woman who brought nothing into the house. She had imagined humiliation. She had imagined anger. She had not imagined this particular flavor of nothing, the sense of standing in front of an entire town and watching them collectively decide she wasn't worth the trouble. $30 for a barren woman who can cook, someone muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. Hell, I got a dog does as much and eats less. More laughter. Crueler this time because it had found its rhythm. Eliza felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, the way water goes right before it freezes. She thought distantly that this was probably the last interesting thing that would ever happen to her, this slow public erasure, and then she would go back to her father's house and exist there as a burden until she didn't anymore. $25, last call, her father said, and there was something almost pleading in it now, not for her sake, but for his own, because an unsold daughter standing on an auction platform was its own kind of embarrassment, and he wanted this over. Nothing. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who ran most of the livestock sales in the county and had clearly never expected to be asked to sell a woman, shifted his weight and looked like he wanted very badly to be somewhere else. Folks, he said, we got a real offer here. $25 for $1. The voice came from the back of the crowd, low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because people had learned to listen to it anyway. Heads turned. Eliza's eyes finally dropped from the feed store sign because she had to see who had just said something so absurd it had to be a joke. It wasn't a joke. Bo Thatcher stood near the edge of the crowd with his hat pushed back slightly off his forehead, a man Eliza recognized only the way you recognize someone you've seen at church or at the mercantile but never actually spoken to. He ran a ranch a few miles out past the creek bend. She knew that much. She knew his wife had died. Everyone knew that. The whole town had worn black armbands to the funeral 8 months back. And she knew vaguely that he had children, though she couldn't have said how many. $1, Bo repeated, like the number hadn't been strange enough the first time. He wasn't smiling. There was nothing performative in his face, no cruelty either, just a kind of plain, tired arithmetic, like a man calculating feed costs. Pruitt looked between Bo and Eliza's father, clearly unsure if this counted as an actual sale or some kind of insult that needed to be addressed. Mr. Thatcher, that's a mighty low offer for a grown woman. It's the only offer, Bo said. Either somebody else bids or she's mine for $1. Nobody else bid. Of course nobody else bid. The crowd had already decided what she was worth, which was nothing, and Bo Thatcher's dollar was less an act of valuation than an act of mercy that didn't even pretend to be generous about it. Eliza's father took the coin with a hand that didn't shake nearly as much as it should have, given that he was selling his own daughter for less than the price of a sack of cornmeal. "Pleasure doing business," he said. And that was it. That was the whole transaction. 26 years of being someone's daughter, ending with a single silver dollar changing hands in front of a crowd that was already losing interest and turning back toward the feed store and the saloon. Bo walked up to the platform and held out his hand to help her down, the same way he might have helped any woman down from a wagon. No different, no special tenderness in it, just practical courtesy. "You got belongings?" he asked. His voice up close was rougher than it had sounded from a distance, like gravel that had been worn smooth in places and not in others. "A trunk," Eliza said, "at my father's house." "We'll get it." That was the entirety of their conversation on the day he bought her. No explanation, no apology for the circumstances, no questions about what she wanted or whether she wanted any of this at all. Though, in fairness, nobody had asked her that question in weeks, and she'd stopped expecting it. The wagon ride out to his ranch took the better part of an hour, and for most of it neither of them spoke. Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the scrubby grassland roll past, trying to understand what exactly she had just become. Not a wife. He hadn't said wife. He hadn't said anything that clarified what role she was meant to occupy in whatever life he was driving her toward. "You got children," she finally said. It wasn't really a question. 5. Bo kept his eyes on the road, on the two horses pulling them steadily forward. Lost their mother in the spring. Influenza took her quick, 3 days from healthy to gone. He said it without flinching, the way men say things they've already cried about in private and don't intend to cry about again in front of strangers. House has been falling apart since. Not the house itself, He gestured vaguely, like he was reaching for a word that didn't quite exist. Everything else. "And you bought me to fix that." "I bought you because nobody else was going to, and you looked like you were about to be left standing there with nobody," Bo said, and for the first time something flickered across his face that wasn't quite emotion, but was close to it. "Whatever happens after, that's up to you and me figuring it out. I'm not buying a wife, Miss Moreland. I already had one of those, and I'm not interested in pretending I can replace her with $1 and an auction. I need help with my children. That's the truth of it." It was, Eliza would think later, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks, even though it stung going down. There was something almost restful about it. No romance to misunderstand, no pretense to maintain. Just a job, badly defined, in a house full of grief she hadn't yet seen. The ranch came into view as the sun was beginning its slow slide toward late afternoon. A low timber house with a wraparound porch that had clearly once been someone's pride and was now sagging slightly at one corner. A barn that looked better maintained than the house, and a yard scattered with the particular chaos of children who had stopped being supervised closely enough. A broken wheel from some forgotten toy. A line of laundry that had fallen and not been picked back up. A dog that came barking toward the wagon and then seemed to lose interest halfway, as though even enthusiasm wasn't worth the effort anymore. "That's Tucker," Bo said, nodding at the dog. "Don't mind him. He barks at everything and means none of it." The front door opened before the wagon had even fully stopped, and a girl who looked to be around 12 stepped out onto the porch with her arms crossed and her chin set in a way that made it immediately clear she had opinions about whatever this was. She had her father's same plain, unimpressed way of looking at the world. "Who's that?" the girl said. Not a greeting, a demand. "This is Eliza," Bo said, climbing down from the wagon. "She's going to help around the house." "We don't need help." The girl's voice cracked slightly on the word need, which undercut the defiance more than she probably wanted it to. "We've been doing fine." Behind her in the doorway, a boy appeared, younger, maybe 10, with a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his face. And behind him, a smaller girl who couldn't have been more than 6, who took one look at the strange woman in the wagon and immediately retreated back into the dark of the house like an animal returning to its den. "Caroline," Bo said, in the tired tone of a man repeating an argument he'd already lost several times, "we have not been doing fine. The wash hasn't been done proper in 2 weeks. Davy's missing buttons off his only good shirt. Mira hasn't said 3 words together since Tuesday." "I'm not 3, the boy, Davy, apparently, snapped, though it wasn't clear what exactly he was disputing. Where are the twins? Bo asked, looking past them into the house. Probably setting something on fire, Caroline said, with the flat delivery of someone who had genuinely stopped finding that funny a long time ago and had simply run out of other reactions. As if summoned by the accusation, two identical boys, no older than 8, came tearing around the side of the house at a dead sprint, one chasing the other with what appeared to be a dead snake held aloft like a trophy, both of them shrieking with the kind of joy that exists specifically to torment siblings. "Tobias, get that thing away from the house!" Bo's voice finally rose, cutting through the chaos with the authority of a man who had clearly had this exact conversation before, probably about this exact snake. The boy named Tobias skidded to a stop, grinning, snake still dangling from his fist. His brother, presumably the other twin, caught up to him and immediately tried to wrestle it away. And within seconds, the two of them were a tangle of limbs and shrieking in the dirt, while the snake, very much dead and entirely unbothered by any of this, flopped uselessly between them. Eliza watched all of this from the wagon seat with the strange sensation of having stepped into a play that had been running for some time already, with no script and no idea what her role was meant to be. 5 children, a dead wife, a father who looked like exhaustion had become a permanent feature of his face rather than a passing state. And her, bought for $1, expected to somehow assemble order out of whatever this was. "Caroline, Davy," Bo said, "this is Eliza. She'll be staying with us. Help her get settled and somebody go pull your brothers apart before they break something." Caroline's eyes moved over Eliza with an assessment that felt entirely too sharp for a 12-year-old, cataloging her dress, her hands, the trunk in the back of the wagon, like she was deciding how much of a threat this woman represented. "She's not our mother," she said finally, to her father, not to Eliza, as though Eliza herself wasn't standing right there and capable of hearing it. "Nobody said she was," Bo said quietly. "Good," Caroline said, and turned and went back inside without another word, the screen door banging shut behind her hard enough to make the whole frame shudder. Davy lingered a moment longer, looking at Eliza with the open, unguarded suspicion that only children seemed capable of, and then he too disappeared inside, leaving Eliza alone on the wagon with Bo, the dog, 2 boys wrestling in the dirt over a dead snake, and a household that had clearly decided, before she'd even stepped down, that she wasn't wanted. "They'll come around," Bo said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced of it himself. He reached up to help her down from the wagon, and this time, when her feet touched the ground, she felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to without ever really agreeing to anything at all. Or they won't. Either way, the work needs doing. The first week passed like something endured rather than lived. Eliza woke before dawn out of old habit and old necessity, and found the kitchen in a state that explained a great deal about why Bo had been so willing to part with $1 at an auction. Dishes from at least 2 days sat crusted in a basin of cold, greasy water. The flour bin had been left open and something, mice most likely, had been at it. A child's shoe sat inexplicably on the table, as though it had wandered there on its own and decided to stay. She started with the dishes, because starting somewhere felt better than standing in the doorway cataloging the scale of the problem. By the time the sun was properly up, she had the kitchen in something resembling order, bread dough rising under a cloth, and a pot of cornmeal mush bubbling on the stove that she suspected, correctly, would be met with deep suspicion by children who had grown accustomed to fending for themselves. Mira was the first to appear, drawn by the smell, a small girl with enormous dark eyes who stood in the doorway and watched Eliza the way she might watch a stranger handling something fragile, wary, ready to bolt. "Good morning," Eliza said, keeping her voice low and even, the way she might address a spooked animal. "There's mush, if you're hungry." Mira said nothing. She didn't move either, just stood there, half in the kitchen and half out of it, like she hadn't yet decided which world she belonged to. "You don't have to talk," Eliza added, turning back to the stove so the child wouldn't feel watched. "Talking's optional around here. Eating's not, though, if you ask me. Growing girls need their breakfast." There was a long pause, and then the soft scuff of bare feet against floorboards, and Mira slid into a chair at the table, still silent but present, which Eliza understood to be its own kind of victory, however small. The rest of the children arrived in stages and with varying degrees of hostility. Davy ate his mush with the wary efficiency of a boy who didn't trust good things to last and wanted to get what he could before they were taken away. The twins, Tobias and his brother, who turned out to be named Samuel, though everyone simply called him Sam, treated the whole breakfast as an opportunity for chaos, flicking spoonfuls of mush at each other until Eliza, without raising her voice, simply removed both their bowls and set them on the counter, out of reach, until they could demonstrate they were capable of eating like people instead of barnyard animals. "That's not fair," Tobias said, outraged. "It's exactly fair," Eliza said. "You'll get it back when you can prove you want it more than you want to throw it." Caroline came last, dressed and composed in a way that felt deliberately performative, like she wanted to make clear that she, at least, did not need anyone's help getting ready in the morning. She looked at the bowl Eliza set in front of her and did not touch it. "I usually make my own breakfast," she said. "You're welcome to," Eliza replied. "I just thought I'd save you the trouble this morning. Tomorrow, if you'd rather, the kitchen's yours." Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, like she'd been braced for an argument and was thrown off balance by not getting one. She ate the mush in silence, but she ate it, which Eliza counted as a second small victory before the day had even properly started. Bo came through the kitchen briefly on his way out to the fields, paused at the sight of the table. 5 children eating, more or less peacefully, at the same time, and looked at Eliza with something that wasn't quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. "Didn't think you'd get them all sitting at once," he said. "I didn't get them sitting," Eliza said. "I got them fed. There's a difference. Sitting's harder." He almost smiled at that. Almost. It didn't quite make it all the way to his mouth, but something in his eyes shifted, just slightly, before he nodded and went out the door, leaving her alone with 5 children who had not yet decided whether to trust her, in a house that had not yet decided whether it could be a home again. The days that followed established a kind of rhythm, though rhythm was perhaps too generous a word for what was really more like a slow, grinding negotiation that played out across every meal, every chore, every small interaction. Eliza learned the particular geography of grief in that house, the way she might have learned the layout of unfamiliar rooms in the dark, carefully, by feel, expecting to bump into something painful at any moment. Caroline's grief had calcified into control. She made her bed with military precision, kept her small collection of belongings arranged with obsessive order, and seemed to view any deviation from routine, a meal served 10 minutes late, a chore done differently than she expected, as a kind of personal betrayal. Eliza came to understand slowly that for a 12-year-old who had lost her mother and watched her father disappear into his own grief, control over small things was the only control she had left, and so Eliza learned to ask before changing things. Even small things, even when asking felt unnecessary. "I was going to wash the curtains today," she told Caroline one morning, not because she needed permission, but because she'd learned that announcing changes ahead of time kept Caroline from feeling ambushed by them. Caroline looked up from where she was darning a sock with more focus than the task strictly required. "Mother washed them on the first Monday of the month." "Then we'll wash them on the first Monday of the month," Eliza said, and watched something in Caroline's shoulders loosen, just slightly, at being deferred to. Davy's grief, by contrast, ran hot. He picked fights with his brothers over nothing, slammed doors with enough force to rattle the windows, and seemed to be perpetually one small disappointment away from an explosion. Eliza learned not to meet his anger with anger of her own, which only seemed to feed it, but also not to back down from it entirely, which he seemed to interpret, dangerously, as permission. "You're not my mother, and you don't get to tell me what to do," he shouted at her one afternoon after she'd asked him 3 times to bring in firewood before dark. "You're right," Eliza said, evenly. "I'm not your mother. I'm the person who's going to be cold tonight if that wood doesn't come in, same as you. So either you bring it in, or we're both cold, and I don't particularly fancy either of us freezing over a chore that takes 10 minutes. He glared at her for a long moment, jaw working, clearly hunting for a counter-argument and not finding one. Then, with considerable bad grace, he stomped out to the woodpile and brought in an armload, dropping it by the stove with unnecessary violence. "Thank you," Eliza said, like he hadn't just thrown it at her feet. He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either, and the next evening, without being asked, he brought in the wood before she'd even noticed dusk was falling. She didn't comment on it. She'd learned by then that praising the children's small steps too loudly only seemed to embarrass them out of repeating them. The twins were a different kind of challenge entirely. Not grief exactly, or not grief in any form she recognized, but a kind of restless, anxious energy that seemed to need an outlet and had decided, in the absence of better guidance, that the outlet would be chaos. They set things on fire, small things usually, and usually accidentally, though usually was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. They caught snakes and frogs, and, on one memorable occasion, a skunk that left the entire house smelling for the better part of a week. They fought each other with a ferocity that suggested deep affection in the way only siblings can manage, and they seemed, more than any of the other children, desperate for someone to simply pay attention to them, even if that attention came in the form of correction. Eliza began giving them jobs, with real purpose, not busy work, feeding the chickens, checking the rabbit hutch, hauling water for the wash. It didn't eliminate the chaos, but it gave the chaos somewhere productive to go. And more than once, she caught the two of them taking genuine pride in some small task completed well, a pride that seemed to surprise them as much as it surprised her. And Mira, small, silent Mira, who had not spoken a full sentence to anyone since her mother died, who flinched at sudden noises and seemed to move through the house like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. Mira was the one who worried Eliza most, precisely because Mira made no demands, caused no trouble, and seemed entirely content to simply disappear into the corners of rooms, watching everything and saying nothing. Eliza didn't push. She'd learned enough in those first weeks to know that pushing children like Mira only drove them further into their silence. Instead, she simply made space. An extra seat near the stove where Mira liked to sit while Eliza cooked, small tasks offered without pressure. A running, one-sided commentary on whatever Eliza happened to be doing that didn't require any response. "I'm making bread today," she told Mira one afternoon, kneading dough on the flour-dusted table while the girl sat nearby, knees pulled up to her chest. "My mother used to say bread's got a mind of its own. You can't rush it. You knead it, and you wait, and you knead it again, and eventually it decides to be bread. Sort of like people, I suppose. You can't rush people into being ready for things either." Mira said nothing, but her eyes followed Eliza's hands, watching the rhythm of the kneading with something that might have been the first real attention she'd given to anything in the house since Eliza's arrival. "You want to try?" Eliza asked, not looking up, keeping her voice light, like the question carried no weight at all. A long silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Mira nodded. Eliza pinched off a small piece of dough and set it in front of the girl, and for several minutes they worked in silence, side by side. Two sets of hands moving over flour and dough, and Eliza thought, with a kind of cautious, unspoken hope, that this quiet, wordless companionship might be the first real crack in the wall the child had built around herself. Yeah, it was Beau, more than the children, who Eliza found hardest to read. He was unfailingly polite, unfailingly fair in his dealings with her, and almost entirely unreadable beneath it. A man who had clearly decided at some point after his wife's death that the safest way to survive grief was to simply stop letting anyone see how deep it ran. He worked from before dawn until well after dark, came in for meals with dirt and sweat ground into his clothes, ate quickly and without much conversation, and retreated to whatever corner of the property still needed his attention. Eliza saw him, in those first weeks, mostly in fragments, his voice carrying across the yard as he corrected one of the twins, the particular set of his shoulders when he thought no one was watching him, the way he sometimes stood at the edge of the fields at dusk, not doing anything, just standing, as though grief required its own kind of labor that had nothing to do with cattle or crops. "He doesn't talk about her," Caroline told Eliza one evening, apropos of nothing, while the two of them were folding laundry together. It was the first time Caroline had offered information rather than defended against it. "Mother, he just stops, sometimes, in the middle of things, like he forgot what he was doing." "Grief does that," Eliza said carefully, folding a small shirt that she guessed belonged to Sam, based on the missing button at the collar. "It's not something you get over so much as something you learn to carry differently." Caroline was quiet for a moment, smoothing a wrinkle out of a pillowcase with more attention than the task required. "Did you love your husband?" she asked, not looking up. The question landed harder than Eliza expected. She thought about Daniel, about the 4 years of a marriage that had been quiet and companionable and never quite warm, about the particular loneliness of being married to someone who treated her more like a household fixture than a wife, about the strange, complicated grief of mourning someone she had cared for without ever quite loving. "I think I love the idea of him," she said finally, because it was the truest answer she had. "We were kind to each other. That's not nothing. But I don't think either of us ever really saw the other person all the way through. It's a different kind of sad than what you've got here. Yours is sharper. Mine was just quieter." Caroline considered this with the careful seriousness of a child working out an equation. "Pa loved Mother all the way through," she said. "That's why he stops sometimes." "I know," Eliza said softly. "I can tell." The first real breakthrough came nearly 3 weeks in, on an evening that started like any other and ended with something shifting, almost imperceptibly, in the architecture of the house. It was Sam, the quieter of the twins, though quieter was relative, given the company, who came to her after supper, holding something small and carefully wrapped in a handkerchief, his expression unusually solemn for a boy who treated most of life as an opportunity for mischief. "This was my mother's," he said, holding it out. "It's a button, from her good dress. I've been keeping it since. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Tobias said I should give it to you, because you're trying." Eliza took the button with both hands, the way she'd received something far more precious than its size suggested, because in every way that mattered, it was. "I'll keep it safe," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Thank you for trusting me with it." Sam nodded, already looking a little embarrassed by his own sincerity, the way children often are, and then he turned and bolted from the room before either of them had to sit too long in the weight of the moment. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Eliza sat at the kitchen table turning the small button over in her fingers, thinking about the strange architecture of trust. How it didn't arrive all at once, in some grand gesture, but in small, quiet offerings, a button wrapped in a handkerchief, a child sitting down to eat without being asked twice, a wordless girl pressing her hands into bread dough. She didn't notice Bo come in until he was already standing in the doorway, having clearly come from outside, smelling of hoarse and cold night air. "Sam tell you about the button?" he asked. "He gave it to me," Eliza said. "Said Tobias told him to." Bo leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something less guarded, less carefully managed. "That was her favorite dress," he said. "Margaret's. Wore it every Sunday. Sam used to sit in her lap during the sermon and play with that button the whole service. Drove the preacher half mad, the fidgeting." He almost smiled, the memory pulling something loose in him for just a moment. "She'd have liked you, Margaret. She had no patience for nonsense, but she'd have respected what you're doing here." "I'm just feeding them and keeping the house from falling apart," Eliza said, though something in her chest had gone warm and tight at the comparison. "That's not all you're doing," Bo said, "and you know it." He pushed off from the doorframe, moving toward the stairs, and then paused, looking back at her with something that, in a different man, in a different conversation, might have been the beginning of real gratitude. "Caroline asked me yesterday if you were going to leave. I told her I didn't know. I should have told her no. I think I'd like to tell her no, if that's something you'd want too." It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even quite an invitation. It was simply a question asked sideways, the way men who weren't used to asking for things sometimes had to come at the asking from an angle. And Eliza understood, in that moment, that she had a choice to make, not just about whether she stayed in this house, but about whether she let herself begin to want to. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not yet. Not unless you're trying to get rid of me." "I'm not," Bo said, quiet but certain. And for the first time since the auction platform, since the silver dollar had changed hands over her head like she was livestock being settled, Eliza felt something that might have been the beginning of belonging. Fragile, unproven, and entirely unearned by anything except the slow daily work of simply staying when it would have been easier to leave. She didn't know yet how soon that fragile beginning would be tested, or how close this house would come to losing everything all over again. She only knew, sitting there with a dead woman's button warm in her palm and a man's quiet gratitude hanging in the air between them, that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had somewhere she wanted to wake up the next morning. The weeks that followed Sam's gift of the button settled into something Eliza almost dared to call routine, though she was careful never to say that word out loud, as if naming it might scare it off. The house still had its sharp edges. Caroline still flinched at sudden changes to the schedule. Davy still slammed doors when his temper outran his patience. The twins still found new and inventive ways to nearly burn down the chicken coop. But underneath all of it, something had shifted, the way a fence post shifts after enough seasons of being leaned on. Not visible from a distance, but solid if you put your weight against it. Eliza found herself waking earlier than she needed to. Not out of obligation anymore, but because she liked the quiet hour before the children stirred, when she could stand on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the light come up gray and then gold over the fields, and feel, for just a few minutes, like the day belonged to her before it belonged to anyone else. It was on one of those mornings, the dew still thick on the grass and the air carrying the particular chill that meant autumn was closing in fast, that Beau came out onto the porch earlier than usual, already dressed for work, and stood next to her without saying anything for a long moment. "You're up early," he said finally. "So are you." "Cattle don't know what day it is." He nodded toward the horizon, where the sky was doing something soft and orange over the tree line. "Storm's coming. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. You can smell it." Eliza breathed in. She couldn't smell anything but coffee and cold grass, but she didn't say so. There was something in the way Beau talked about weather, about land, about the rhythm of the ranch, that reminded her of the way some men talked about scripture, with a kind of devotion that didn't need to explain itself to be believed. "Caroline's birthday is coming up," he said, after a pause, in the tone of a man working up to something. 13. Margaret always made a cake. Big production. Flour everywhere. He cleared his throat. "I don't know how to make a cake." "I do," Eliza said. "I know you do. That's why I'm telling you." He looked at her sideways, almost sheepish, which was an expression she hadn't yet seen on his face and found she liked more than she expected to. She won't ask for it herself, too proud. But it'll mean something if it happens without her having to ask. "Then it'll happen," Eliza said, and watched some of the tension go out of his shoulders, like he'd been carrying that small worry around for days, waiting for the right moment to hand it off. He didn't thank her. Beau wasn't a man who used the word thank you easily. It seemed to cost him something he wasn't always willing to spend. But he stood there a moment longer than he needed to before heading off toward the barn, and Eliza understood that to be its own kind of gratitude translated into a language she was slowly learning to read. Caroline's birthday arrived on a Thursday, cool and overcast, the kind of day that threatened rain without delivering it. Eliza spent the morning baking in secret, shooing the twins out of the kitchen twice when their curiosity overcame their good sense. And by the time Caroline came in from her chores in the early afternoon, there was a cake sitting on the table. Simple, a little uneven on one side where Eliza had rushed the frosting, but unmistakably a birthday cake, with 13 candle stubs pressed crookedly into the top, because real candles were too dear to spare and stubs were what they had. Caroline stopped in the doorway. For a moment her face did something complicated. Surprise, then something that looked almost like grief, the kind that comes sideways when you're not expecting it, triggered by something as small as a cake. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice tighter than the words required. "I know," Eliza said. "I wanted to. Pa told you it was my birthday." "He did. He also told me your mother always made a cake. I figured that was worth keeping, even if I can't make it taste the same as hers." Caroline crossed the kitchen slowly, like she was approaching something that might dissolve if she moved too fast, and stood looking down at the cake, at the crooked candles, at the lopsided frosting that Eliza hadn't bothered to hide because hiding imperfection had never struck her as worth the effort. "She used to let me lick the bowl," Caroline said quietly, "even when I was too old for it. Said a girl's never too old to lick a cake bowl." "There's a bowl in the wash basin with frosting still in it," Eliza said. "I left some on purpose." Caroline looked up at her, and for the first time since Eliza had arrived at the ranch, something behind the girl's careful composure simply gave way. Not dramatically, not with tears exactly, though her eyes were wet, but with a kind of quiet collapse of the wall she'd built between herself and the world since her mother died. She crossed the remaining distance and wrapped her arms around Eliza's waist, face pressed into her shoulder, not saying anything at all, and Eliza stood very still and let her, one hand coming up to rest against the back of the girl's head, careful, like she was holding something that had been broken once and was only just now trusting itself to be held again. "Happy birthday, Caroline," Eliza said softly. "Thank you," Caroline mumbled into her shoulder, and then, almost too quiet to hear, "for staying." "Yay." Bo came in from the fields just as the children were gathering around the table, drawn by the smell of cake and the rare sound of all 5 of them in one room without shouting, and he stood in the doorway taking in the sight of it. Caroline wiping her eyes and pretending she wasn't, the twins already arguing over who got the bigger piece, Davy trying to look too old to care about cake, and failing, Mira perched on her usual chair near the stove, watching everything with her enormous quiet eyes, and something in his face, when Eliza glanced over at him, had gone soft in a way she hadn't seen since the day he'd told her Margaret would have liked her. "Looks like a good birthday," he said. "It is," Caroline said, with more conviction than she'd shown about anything in weeks, and cut herself a slice of cake without waiting to be asked. But grief, Eliza was learning, didn't move in straight lines. It came back in waves, unpredictable, sometimes triggered by nothing at all. And the good days were never a guarantee against the bad ones. It was Davy who broke first, about a week after Caroline's birthday, on an evening that had started ordinarily enough, supper, chores, the usual low hum of sibling bickering, and ended with him standing in the yard in the near dark, fists clenched, refusing to come inside, while Eliza stood on the porch trying to figure out what had set him off. "Davy," she called, "it's getting cold. Come in." "I don't want to." "That's not really the question I asked." He didn't answer, just stood there with his back to her, shoulders hunched up around his ears, and something in the rigid line of his posture told her this wasn't simple stubbornness. She came down off the porch and crossed the yard, slow, the way she'd approach a spooked horse, and stopped a few feet away from him. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing happened." "Davy?" He turned around then, and even in the failing light she could see his face was wet, could see the particular fury of a boy who hated being caught crying more than he hated whatever had made him cry in the first place. "Tobias found Ma's sewing basket," he said, the words coming out fast and angry, like he needed to get rid of them before they choked him. "In the back of the closet. He didn't know what it was. He was just looking for something to use for his stupid frog collection, and he pulled it out, and there was still thread on the needle, from whatever she was working on, before. And he just held it up and asked what it was, like it was nothing, like it was just some old basket, and He stopped, breathing hard, fists still clenched. "And it's not nothing," Eliza said quietly. "It's not nothing," he repeated, voice cracking. "She was in the middle of something. She didn't even get to finish it. Nobody even knows what she was making. It's just stuck there, half done, forever." Eliza didn't reach for him, not yet, sensing that he needed the space to finish whatever was working its way up out of him before he could accept being touched. "That happens sometimes," she said. "People leave things unfinished. It doesn't mean it didn't matter. It just means there wasn't time." "That's not fair," Davy said, and it wasn't clear anymore whether he meant the basket or his mother dying or the entire unbearable architecture of loss that a 10-year-old boy had no good way of understanding. "It's not fair that she just stopped in the middle of things, like nothing she was doing mattered enough to finish." "It mattered," Eliza said. "It mattered enough that you remember it. That's not nothing, Davy. That basket sitting in that closet with the needles still threaded, that's proof she was here, living a whole life, right up until she couldn't anymore. That's not sad because it's unfinished. It's sad because it shows how much there still was left to do, how much more she wanted to give you." He was crying properly now, the kind of crying that boys his age tried desperately to disguise as something else. Coughing, wiping his face too roughly, turning his head away, and Eliza closed the remaining distance and put a hand on his shoulder, not pulling him in, just letting the weight of it sit there, an offer he could take or leave. He took it. He turned and pressed his face against her arm, not quite hugging her the way Caroline had, more like a boy too proud to fully surrender but too exhausted to keep fighting, and Eliza stood there in the cooling dark of the yard and let him cry, one hand resting lightly on his back, saying nothing at all. because there was nothing to say that would fix what was broken, only things to say that might make the broken thing a little easier to carry. When he finally pulled back, wiping his nose on his sleeve with no particular dignity, he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "Don't tell the others," he muttered. "I won't. And don't," he hesitated like the next part cost him something, "don't throw the basket out, even if it's stupid to keep it." "It's not stupid," Eliza said. "And I wasn't going to throw anything out. It's hers. It belongs in this house same as the rest of you." He nodded, finally, and the two of them walked back toward the porch together in silence, and Eliza thought, watching him scrub the last of the tears off his face before they reached the door, that grief in children didn't look like grief in adults. It came out sideways, as anger, as snakes thrown at siblings, as slammed doors, as a boy standing alone in a dark yard furious at a half-finished piece of sewing. But underneath all of it, it was the exact same ache, just dressed in a smaller body that hadn't yet learned how to carry it gracefully. It was around this time, as autumn deepened and the nights grew sharp with the first real cold, that Beau began, almost without seeming to notice he was doing it, talking to Eliza in the evenings after the children were in bed. It started small, a comment about the cattle, about a fence that needed mending before winter, about a neighbor's poor harvest. But it grew, night by night, into something closer to actual conversation, the kind where two people sat across a table from each other, not because there was business to discuss, but because the silence had simply become comfortable enough to fill with words that didn't need a purpose. "You ever think about what you wanted before all this?" Beau asked one night, turning his coffee cup slowly between his palms, not quite looking at her. "Before the auction. Before any of it." Eliza considered the question longer than it probably warranted. "I wanted to be useful," she said finally. "That sounds small, maybe. But growing up, with a father like mine, useful was the only currency that mattered. If you weren't useful, you weren't worth feeding. I think some part of me always believed that. Still does, if I'm honest." "That's not small," Beau said. "That's just sad, the way you learned it. What about you?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning the cup again. "I wanted land," he said. "Simple as that, when I was young. Wanted something that was mine, that nobody could sell out from under me or take away on a whim. Got the land, got Margaret, who I never deserved half as much as I got her, got the children." His jaw tightened slightly. "Then I lost her, and for a while I figured I'd lose all of it too. The land, the kids, everything. Figured a man can't hold a family together with just his own two hands when half of what was holding it together is suddenly gone." "You're not holding it together with just your own two hands anymore," Eliza said quietly. Beau looked up at her then, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Gratitude, yes, but also something more uncertain, like a man standing at the edge of a feeling he wasn't sure he had permission to have yet. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." He didn't say anything more than that. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't the old, careful silence of two strangers occupying the same space. It had warmth in it now, the kind that didn't require filling, and Eliza found, sitting there with her own coffee going cold in front of her, that she didn't want to be anywhere else. The trouble, when it came, arrived the way trouble usually does in a house that has only just begun to heal, without warning, on an ordinary day that gave no sign it intended to become anything other than ordinary. It started with Mira being unusually quiet at breakfast, which on its own meant little, because Mira was always quiet. But she didn't eat, pushing her mush around the bowl without lifting the spoon to her mouth. And when Eliza pressed a hand to her forehead out of habit more than concern, she found the girl's skin warmer than it should have been. "You feeling all right, sweetheart?" she asked, crouching down to Mira's level. Mira shook her head, just slightly, the most direct communication she'd offered in weeks, and that alone was enough to set something uneasy turning in Eliza's stomach. "Let's get you lying down," she said, scooping the girl up. She weighed almost nothing, a fact that always startled Eliza a little, how light a 6-year-old body could be, and carried her to the small bedroom she shared with Caroline, laying her down on top of the quilt and pulling a blanket over her despite the warmth radiating off her skin. By midday, the fever had climbed enough that Eliza's unease had sharpened into something closer to alarm. Mira's cheeks were flushed and unhealthy red, her breathing slightly too fast, and when Eliza tried to coax a few sips of water into her, The girl barely managed to swallow before turning her face away, eyes glassy and unfocused. Caroline appeared in the doorway, drawn by the change in the house's rhythm, the way children always seem to sense when something has gone wrong before anyone tells them outright. "Is she sick?" she asked, voice already tight with the particular fear of a child who has already lost one parent to illness and understands, in her bones, exactly how fast sickness can take someone away. "She's got a fever," Eliza said, keeping her own voice level for Caroline's sake, even as her hands, wringing out a cloth in a basin of cool water, weren't entirely steady. "We're going to take care of her. Can you fetch me more water? And find your father? Tell him I need him." Caroline didn't move for a moment, frozen by something that looked very much like the beginning of panic, her eyes fixed on her little sister's flushed face. "Caroline," Eliza said, sharper now, not unkind but urgent. "Water, your father, go." That seemed to break whatever had locked the girl in place, and she turned and ran, and Eliza heard her voice carrying through the house a moment later, calling for her father with a fear in it that made every other child in the house go quiet and still. Bo came in from the barn at a dead run, boots still caked in mud, and took one look at Mira's face before his own went pale and tight in a way Eliza hadn't seen from him before, not even on the day he'd talked about Margaret's death. "How long's she been like this?" he asked, kneeling by the bed, his hand hovering over his daughter's forehead, like he was almost afraid to confirm what he already suspected. "She was off her food this morning. Fever's climbed steady since." Eliza wrung out the cloth again and laid it across Mira's forehead. "It came on fast, Bo." "Fast," he repeated, and something in his voice cracked slightly around the edges, because Eliza understood, without him having to say it, exactly what he was thinking. Margaret had gone from healthy to gone in 3 days. Influenza had taken her quick, with no warning, no mercy, and now here was his youngest daughter, burning up in front of him, on a fever that had appeared out of nowhere in the space of a single morning. "I need you to ride for the doctor," Eliza said, keeping her voice as steady and practical as she could manage, because someone in the room needed to be steady, and it clearly wasn't going to be him, not in this moment. "Doc Hensley in town. Tell him it's a child high fever came on sudden. Tell him to bring whatever he's got for fever and for the lungs, in case it settles there." Bo was already moving, already halfway to the door, when he stopped and turned back just for a second. "Don't let anything happen to her," he said. And it wasn't a command, it was closer to a plea, the voice of a man who had already buried one person he loved and could not survive burying another. "I won't," Eliza said, with far more confidence than she actually felt, because there was no version of this moment where telling him the truth, that she didn't know, that fevers in children could go either way no matter how hard anyone fought them, that she was as frightened as he was, would help either of them get through what was coming. He left. Eliza heard the horse take off at a gallop a moment later, the sound of hooves fading fast down the road toward town, and then she was alone with 5 frightened children and one small burning body that felt suddenly like the only thing in the world that mattered. The house, in the hour after Bo left, took on the particular stillness of a place holding its breath. Eliza moved through it with a brisk, deliberate calm she did not entirely feel, because 4 other children were watching her now, taking their cues from her face the way young animals take their cues from the herd, and she could not afford to let them see the fear sitting underneath her composure. "Caroline, I need that water now," she said, and Caroline, who had returned with a full bucket and was hovering uselessly in the doorway, hurried it over. "Good girl. Now, I need clean cloths, as many as you can find. Davy, I need you to keep your brothers out of this room. They can help by staying calm and staying out of the way. Can you do that?" Davy, pale and tight-jawed, nodded without his usual argument, and herded the twins, who had gone for once entirely silent, sensing the gravity of the moment in a way that cut through even their restless energy, out into the front room, where Eliza could hear him telling them, in a voice trying hard to sound like his father's, that Mira was going to be fine, that the doctor was coming, that they just had to wait. She soaked the cloth again and laid it across Mira's forehead, then her wrists, then the back of her neck, anywhere the fever might be coaxed out through the skin. The girl's breathing had gone shallow and quick, her small chest rising and falling too fast. And when Eliza pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, the pulse hammering underneath felt frantic, like something trying to escape. "Mira," she said softly. I need you to drink a little for me. Just a little. Mira's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, finding Eliza's face after a moment with the kind of slow, drugged recognition that came from a fever burning too hot. Her lips moved, barely, no sound coming out. That's all right, Eliza murmured. You don't have to talk, just drink. She tipped a few drops of water against the girl's cracked lips, and after a moment of resistance, Mira swallowed, and then again, small sips, enough to keep something in her. Caroline returned with an armful of cloths and stood at the foot of the bed, eyes huge, watching her little sister with an expression Eliza recognized because she'd seen its twin on Davy's face in the yard a week earlier. The particular terror of a child who already understood, far too young, exactly what death looked like before it arrived, and was now watching its shadow fall over someone else they loved. She's not going to die, Caroline said. And it wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a statement either. It was somewhere in between, a child reaching for reassurance and bracing herself in case the reassurance didn't come. I'm not going to let that happen, Eliza said, which was not the same thing as a promise that nothing would happen, but it was the truest thing she could offer, and Caroline seemed to understand the difference because she nodded slowly and didn't ask again. The afternoon stretched out long and terrible. Eliza kept up the cloths, kept coaxing water past Mira's lips, kept her voice low and steady, even as the fever showed no sign of breaking, climbing instead, the girl's small body radiating heat like a stove left too long unattended. At one point, Mira began to shiver violently despite the heat pouring off her skin, teeth chattering, and Eliza had to fight the instinct to pile blankets on her, knowing that doing so would only trap the fever deeper. It's all right, she said, holding the girl's hand, feeling it tremble against her own. It's all right. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the afternoon light began its slow slide toward evening, and still no sign of Beau, no sign of the doctor, and Eliza found herself glancing toward the window more often than she wanted to admit, listening for hooves on the road, for any sign that help was coming. It was full dark, the kind of black that swallows a frontier house whole when there's no moon to soften it. By the time she finally heard it, the sound of horses, more than one, coming up the road at speed. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move, watching two riders swing down off their mounts in the yard, one of them Beau, the other an older man with a doctor's bag clutched under his arm. They came in fast, Beau's face carved out of pure exhausted fear, and the doctor, Hensley, gray-haired, with the brisk, unbothered manner of a man who had seen 100 fevers and intended to treat this one the same way, moved past both of them straight to the bed without wasting time on greetings. "How long's the fever been this high?" he asked, pressing the back of his hand to Mira's forehead, then checking her pulse, lifting her eyelids briefly to check her eyes. "Since this morning," Eliza said, "climbing steady all day. She had a few sips of water but nothing more. Shivering despite the heat about an hour back." Hensley grunted, the particular non-committal grunt of a doctor who didn't like what he was finding but wasn't yet ready to say so out loud. He listened to her chest with an ear pressed close to her small body, frowning, listening longer than Eliza liked. "Lungs sound clear enough for now," he said finally, straightening. "That's good. That's the thing to watch for. Once a fever like this settles in the chest, that's when it turns dangerous fast. Right now, it's just the fever itself we're fighting." He opened his bag, pulled out a small bottle. "Willow bark tincture. Helps some, not a miracle. Keep the cloths going, keep trying to get water into her. Don't smother her in blankets no matter how hard she shivers. That shivering's just her body trying to burn through it." He glanced at Beau, who was standing rigid in the doorway, looking like a man trying very hard not to fall apart in front of his children. "Fever's got a break on its own, son. Nothing I've got in this bag does that for you. All we can do is keep her comfortable and keep watching for trouble." "How long?" Beau said, voice tight. "Before we know which way it's going. Could be hours, could be tomorrow morning." Hensley's face softened, just slightly, the practiced kindness of a man who'd delivered this exact uncertain answer to exact frightened parents more times than he probably wanted to count. "I know that's not the answer you wanted. It's the only honest one I've got." He left a few minutes later with instructions to send for him again if her breathing changed or the fever spiked higher and the house fell back into its held-breath stillness. Except now, it was just the two of them, Beau and Eliza, standing on either side of a small fevered body, with 4 other children somewhere in the house pretending to sleep and almost certainly not managing it. "Go check on them," Eliza said quietly. "Caroline especially. She's old enough to understand exactly what's at stake here, and that's its own kind of hard." Bo hesitated, looking down at Mira, like leaving the room felt like a betrayal of some kind. But he nodded and went, and Eliza heard him moving through the house, low voices in the dark. The particular hush of a father trying to reassure children he wasn't entirely sure he could reassure honestly. He came back perhaps 20 minutes later and found Eliza still at the bedside, cloth in hand, going through the same motions. Wet the cloth, wring it out, lay it against burning skin, coax a few drops of water past dry lips. Repeat. With the kind of patient, mechanical persistence that comes from deciding, somewhere deep down, that stopping simply was not an option. "They're settled," he said. "Caroline's not sleeping. Don't think any of them are, really, but they're settled." "Good." He pulled a chair up on the other side of the bed and sat, watching his daughter's face in the lamplight, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The only sounds in the room Mira's too fast breathing and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. "You should sleep," Eliza said eventually. "I'll wake you if anything changes." "Not a chance," Bo said, and there was no room for argument in it. The night that followed was the longest Eliza could remember living through. The fever did not break. If anything, sometime past midnight it seemed to climb again, Mira's small body almost too hot to touch, her breathing turning ragged in a way that made both of them lean forward at the same moment, hearts in their throats, listening for the wet rattle in the lungs that Hensley had warned them to fear. It didn't come. Not yet. But the fear of it sat in the room like a third presence, and Eliza found herself praying, in the wordless, formless way of someone who had never been taught to pray properly but understood, in moments like this, exactly why people reached for something bigger than themselves when they ran out of their own strength, not to any particular God, just outward, into the dark, toward whatever might be listening, asking for one small mercy. Around 2 a.m, Bo's head began to nod despite himself, exhaustion finally winning the small war he'd been fighting against it, and Eliza reached over and put a hand on his arm. "Sleep for an hour," she said. "I've got her. I promise I'll wake you the second anything changes." "I can't." "You can. You're no good to her exhausted past thinking straight. Sleep an hour. I'm not leaving this room." He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words. An acknowledgement, maybe, of how completely he had come to trust her with the thing that mattered most to him in the world, more completely than he had trusted anyone since Margaret died. He nodded finally, and let his head rest back against the wall, and within minutes his breathing had evened out into the heavy rhythm of exhausted sleep. Eliza kept her vigil alone after that, the lamp burning low, the house silent except for the small, ragged sounds of a child fighting something her body didn't fully understand how to fight. She talked to Mira through the worst of it, low and constant, not expecting any response, just filling the dark with something other than fear. "You're stronger than this fever," she murmured, wringing out the cloth again, laying it against the girl's burning forehead. "You hear me? I've seen you. I've seen you sitting in that kitchen watching everything with those big eyes of yours, taking it all in, deciding for yourself when you were ready to trust people again. That takes strength, more strength than most grown folks have. You're not done yet. You've got a whole life of deciding things for yourself still ahead of you, and I am not going to let a fever take that away from you. Not tonight, not ever, if I've got anything to say about it." Somewhere around 4 a.m, Mira's breathing hitched, caught, and for one terrible, suspended second, Eliza thought the worst had arrived. And then the girl coughed, weak and shallow, and settled again, her chest continuing its too fast rise and fall, still fighting, still here. Eliza pressed her forehead briefly against the back of her own hand, just for a moment, just long enough to let the fear move through her without letting it take hold. And then she went back to the cloths, back to the water, back to the low murmur of words into the dark, because stopping was not something she was willing to do. Not for this child. Not after everything it had taken just to get this far. The fever broke a little after 5 in the gray hour before true dawn, so quietly that Eliza almost missed it. A change in the quality of the heat radiating off Mira's skin, a softening, and then, unmistakably, the first faint dampness of sweat breaking across her forehead, the body finally surrendering whatever it had been holding so violently against. "Bo," Eliza said, reaching across to shake his shoulder, her own voice cracking with something that was equal parts exhaustion and disbelieving relief. "Bo, wake up. It's breaking. The fever's breaking." He came awake fast, lurching forward, hand immediately going to his daughter's forehead, and Eliza watched his face as he registered what she already knew. The dampness, the cooling skin, the way Mira's breathing had begun, almost imperceptibly, to slow and deepen. He started, and couldn't finish it, his voice simply giving out. "She's going to be all right," Eliza said. "I think she's going to be all right." Bo made a sound then that Eliza had never heard from him before. Something caught between a laugh and a sob, and he sat there with his hand on his daughter's damp forehead, shoulders shaking, the entire weight of the last 24 hours finally breaking loose all at once. Eliza reached over without thinking and put a hand on his back, the same way she might have steadied Davy in the yard, and he let her, didn't pull away, didn't perform composure he didn't have, just sat there shaking quietly with his daughter's small hand held in his. By full morning, Mira was sleeping properly for the first time in over a day. Real sleep, deep and easy, not the fevered half-consciousness that had gripped her through the worst of the night. And the rest of the house, which had spent the night in fragments of fitful waiting, gathered slowly in the doorway of the small bedroom, drawn by the news that had already traveled through the walls the way news always does in a house full of frightened children. "She's sleeping," Caroline whispered, as though raising her voice might somehow undo the miracle of it. "Really sleeping?" "Really sleeping," Eliza confirmed, and watched the girl's shoulders drop with relief so total it looked almost like pain. The twins, for once entirely without mischief in them, crept to the edge of the bed and looked at their sister's peaceful face with the wide, uncomprehending solemnity of children who had come very close to understanding something they weren't ready to understand, and then crept back out again, quiet, like they understood instinctively that this room needed to stay calm a while longer. Davy lingered longest, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching Eliza where she sat slumped slightly in her chair, eyes red-rimmed from the long night, hands still faintly damp from the cloths she'd been wringing out for hours. "You didn't sleep at all," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "You could have. Pa was here." "He needed sleep more than I did," Eliza said. "Besides, I wasn't going to leave her." Davy looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that he didn't have words for yet, and then he simply nodded once and went to find his brothers. And Eliza understood, watching him go, that something had shifted in that boy's understanding of her, something that no amount of cake or quiet patience could have built quite as fast as one long, terrible night spent fighting for his sister's life. Chitchuts. Mira slept through most of that day, waking periodically for water and a little broth, each time a little stronger, a little more present, until by evening she was sitting up against the pillows, pale and thin, but unmistakably herself, watching the comings and goings of her siblings with her old quiet attention restored. It was that evening, with the worst of the danger clearly past, that Mira did something none of them had heard her do in the 8 months since her mother died. She spoke. Not much, just a few words, her voice rusty with disuse, directed at Eliza, who was sitting beside the bed spooning broth between her lips. "You stayed," Mira said. Eliza's hand went still for a moment, the spoon hovering. "Of course I stayed," she said, when she trusted her voice enough to use it. "Where else would I be? Caroline said you didn't sleep the whole night." Mira's eyes, still a little glassy with the lingering fever but clearer now, fixed on Eliza's face with the same careful, assessing attention she'd given everything since Eliza had first arrived. Except now there was something different underneath it. Not suspicion anymore, but something closer to trust finally landing somewhere solid. "Why?" "Because you matter," Eliza said simply. "And when something matters that much, you don't sleep through it. You just don't." Mira considered this with the particular seriousness small children bring to questions that adults often answer too quickly, and then, very quietly, she said, "Mama would have liked you." It was nearly the same thing Bo had said weeks earlier, almost word for word, and hearing it now, from this child who had said almost nothing at all since her mother's death, landed with a different weight entirely. Not comparison, but inheritance, like the family was slowly, child by child, deciding to hand her something they'd been guarding carefully since loss had first torn through their house. "I'd have liked to know her," Eliza said, throat tight. "From everything I've heard, she sounds like she was someone worth missing this much." Mira nodded, solemn, and let her head rest back against the pillow, eyes drifting closed again, this time with the easy, unafraid sleep of a child who had decided, somewhere in the last 24 hours, that the world contained at least one more person who could be trusted to stay. Mom. Bo found Eliza later that night, sitting alone on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, watching the stars come out hard and bright over the dark fields, too wrung out by the last 2 days to do anything but sit and let the quiet settle into her bones. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside her on the porch step, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even without their shoulders touching. And for a long while they simply sat together in the kind of silence that had stopped being uncomfortable weeks ago and had become instead something closer to companionship. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did," he said finally. "There's not words big enough for it. I keep trying to find them and they all come up too small." "You don't have to," Eliza said. "I didn't do it to be thanked." "I know that. That's sort of the whole problem." He turned his head to look at her, and in the dim light spilling from the kitchen window, his face had none of its usual careful guard left on it. "You didn't do it because you had to. You weren't obligated. $1 at an auction doesn't obligate a person to sit up an entire night fighting for a child that isn't theirs." "Shh. She is mine," Eliza said, before she'd fully thought the words through, and then, hearing how they sounded, didn't take them back. Not in the way you mean. I know that. I know she's not mine the way she's yours, the way she was Margaret's, but she's mine in every way that matters to me now. All of them are. I didn't plan on that happening. It just did, somewhere along the way, while I was busy trying to fix a kitchen and keep a household running. Bo was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark fields rather than at her, and when he spoke again his voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not even during the worst of the fever. "I bought you for $1, he said, told myself it was practical. Told myself I just needed help, and you needed somewhere to go. And it wasn't anything more complicated than two people solving two separate problems." He shook his head slightly. "I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think it's been true for a while, if I'm honest with myself, which I haven't been, because being honest with myself about it means admitting something I wasn't ready to admit." Eliza's heart had started beating harder, though she kept her face carefully still, the same careful stillness she'd practiced on the auction platform all those weeks ago, except this time it wasn't to survive being looked at. It was because she was afraid of what her own face might give away if she let it. "What weren't you ready to admit?" she asked. Bo turned to look at her fully then, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to settle something in him, some last hesitation finally giving way. "That I don't just need you here," he said. "I want you here. Those are two very different things, and it took watching you sit up all night fighting for my daughter's life to understand which one was actually true." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the cold night air settling around them, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, indifferent to the small, enormous thing happening on the porch of a frontier ranch house. Then Eliza reached over, slowly, and took his hand, and he let her, his fingers closing around hers with a kind of careful certainty, like a man finally setting down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I'm not going anywhere," Eliza said again, the same words she'd offered weeks ago after the button, except this time they meant something entirely different, something neither of them was ready to name out loud just yet, sitting there in the dark with 5 sleeping children inside and a fever finally, mercifully broken. They had no way of knowing, in that quiet, fragile moment of two people finally admitting what had grown between them, that the peace they'd just begun to build was about to be tested by something neither a doctor's bag nor a long night of vigilance could fix. A threat that wouldn't come from fever or grief, but from the outside world, from a past Eliza had thought she'd left behind on an auction platform months ago, now circling back to claim what little she'd managed to build. Mira's recovery, once it took hold, seemed to pull the whole house forward with it, like a stone finally rolling free after being lodged against a current for months. By the end of that week, she was up and moving again, thin and a little wobbly on her legs, but undeniably herself, trailing after Eliza through the kitchen with the kind of quiet, constant presence of a child who had decided, somewhere in the depths of that long fever, exactly where she belonged. The change in her was not loud. Mira did not become a chatterbox overnight, did not suddenly fill the house with the kind of noise her brothers specialized in. But she spoke now, in small offerings, a sentence here, a question there, and each one landed in the household like a small, hard-won gift, something the other children seemed to recognize as precious, even when they didn't make a fuss over it. "Why do you put the salt in before the water boils?" she asked one morning, perched on her usual stool near the stove, watching Eliza's hands move through the familiar motions of breakfast. "Habit, mostly," Eliza said. "My mother did it that way. Never asked her why. Some things you just do because somebody before you did them, and eventually you stop questioning it. That doesn't seem like a good reason." "No," Eliza agreed, smiling despite herself. "It isn't, really. But it tastes the same either way, so I never bothered to change it." Mira considered this with her usual gravity and seemed satisfied, and went back to watching. And Eliza thought, not for the first time, that there was something in this child's careful, patient attention that reminded her of herself at that age, the habit of watching closely before deciding whether the world deserved her trust. The household had settled, in the weeks since the fever, into something that finally deserved the word home rather than house. Caroline had stopped treating every small change as a threat to be managed. She'd started, instead, bringing Eliza small confidences, worries about a friend in town, questions about growing older that she clearly hadn't felt comfortable asking her father. Davy had traded his anger for a kind of gruff, protective loyalty, the sort that showed itself in small acts rather than words. Fixing a loose porch step without being asked, walking Eliza to the well at dusk without ever admitting that was what he was doing. The twins had channeled their chaos into something closer to genuine usefulness, taking real pride now in the chores they'd once treated as punishment, occasionally even competing over who could do them better, which was its own kind of miracle, given how recently they'd treated competition as an excuse for destruction. And Bo had changed most of all, in ways that were harder to name precisely because they were so quiet. He laughed now, sometimes, at the dinner table, a low, rusty sound like a door that hadn't been opened in a long while, finally swinging free on its hinges. He found small excuses to be near Eliza in the evenings, lingering in the kitchen after supper instead of disappearing immediately to whatever chore still needed doing. And more than once she'd caught him simply watching her with an expression he didn't bother to hide anymore, something unguarded and a little amazed, like a man still getting used to the fact that his life had room in it for this kind of quiet happiness after everything it had taken from him. They hadn't spoken again in so many words about what had passed between them on the porch the night Mira's fever broke. But it lived in the small things now. The way his hand found hers when they passed in the hallway, brief and almost accidental, except that it happened too often to be accidental. The way he'd taken to walking her partway to the henhouse in the mornings under no excuse at all, just to have a few minutes of her company before the day's work pulled him away. The way, one evening, he'd simply reached across the table during a lull in the children's chatter and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, unthinking gesture of tenderness that made Caroline go very still and very interested in her plate, and made the twins exchange a look that suggested they'd noticed and had opinions they weren't yet brave enough to voice. It was Caroline, in fact, who finally said something out loud, cornering Eliza in the kitchen one afternoon while the boys were out at chores. "Are you going to marry Pa?" she asked, with the particular bluntness of a child who has decided that adults take entirely too long to say obvious things out loud. Eliza nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. That's not really something either of us has discussed, Caroline." "But you want to." "That's not the same as it being something that's going to happen." Caroline studied her for a long moment in that sharp, assessing way she had, and then said, with surprising gentleness for a girl who had spent her first weeks treating Eliza like an invading army, "I think Mother would understand, if you did. I used to think it would feel like she was being replaced. It doesn't feel like that anymore. It feels like the house just got bigger enough to hold more people loving it." It was, Eliza thought later, turning the words over in her mind while she finished the dishes, One of the truest and most generous things anyone in that house had said to her, and it came from a child who, 4 months ago, had told her to her face that nobody wanted her there. The trouble arrived on an afternoon indistinguishable from any other, which was perhaps the cruelest thing about it. That disaster so often announces itself with nothing more than the ordinary sound of wagon wheels on a dirt road, giving no warning at all that the day was about to turn. Eliza was hanging wash when she heard the wagon approaching, and she didn't think much of it at first. Visitors weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. Until she recognized the woman climbing down from it and felt something in her stomach drop straight through the floor of the world. Verna Crandall. Eliza hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years, not since before her husband Daniel had died, but she would have known that face anywhere. The same sharp, pinched features, the same eyes that had always looked at Eliza like she was something slightly distasteful that had wandered too close. Verna had been Daniel's cousin, the kind of relation who showed up uninvited to family gatherings to criticize the food and left before helping clean up, and she had never, not once in the years Eliza had known her, missed an opportunity to remind Eliza that she'd married beneath her own family's expectations and failed to deliver on the one thing a wife was supposedly for. "Mrs. Moreland," Verna said, and even the name landed wrong, deliberately so, a small cruelty disguised as formality. Or should I say Miss Moreland again, given the circumstances? "I hear you've found yourself a new arrangement." "Verna." Eliza set down the wet shirt she'd been about to pin and straightened, every instinct in her body going on alert. "What are you doing out here?" "I've come about the children," Verna said and smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Word travels, you know, even out here in the middle of nowhere. A barren woman, sold off at auction for $1, now playing mother to 5 children that aren't hers, in a house she has no legal claim to whatsoever." She let that sit for a moment, watching Eliza's face. "I thought someone ought to look into whether that's entirely appropriate." "They're well cared for," Eliza said, fighting to keep her voice even despite the cold dread spreading through her chest. "Better cared for than they've been since their mother died, if you want the truth of it." "Do I want the truth of it?" Verna's eyebrow arched. "I want what's right. And what's right is that children don't get raised by women with no legal standing, no marriage, no blood relation, and—" her eyes flicked over Eliza with deliberate cruelty, "a reputation that includes being sold like livestock because her own father couldn't be bothered to keep feeding her. I've already spoken with the county office. There'll be an inquiry." The word landed like a physical blow. "An inquiry?" Eliza repeated. "Into what exactly?" "Into whether Mr. Thatcher's household is a fit place for 5 young children, given the unmarried woman currently residing in it with no legal authority over them whatsoever." Verna's smile widened, satisfied, like a woman who had been waiting a long time for an opportunity to wield whatever small power she had over someone she'd never liked. "It's nothing personal, Eliza. It's simply the law. Children deserve proper structure, proper legitimacy, not whatever arrangement this is." "It's entirely personal," Eliza said, and for the first time in months she felt something close to the old fury she'd buried at the auction, the fury of being judged by someone who knew nothing real about her life and had decided anyway that she had the right to dismantle it. "You've never liked me, Verna. Not once, not for one single day since I married into your family. This isn't about the children's welfare. This is about you finding an excuse to hurt me because you've always wanted to." "Believe whatever helps you sleep at night," Verna said, climbing back into her wagon with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who had said exactly what she'd come to say. "The county will be in touch. I'd start preparing yourself if I were you. Arrangements like this rarely survive close inspection." She drove off without another word, leaving Eliza standing in the yard among the half-hung wash, her hands trembling now in a way she could no longer hide, the cold dread in her chest spreading into something close to panic. She told Beau that evening, after the children were in bed, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, she had no intention of drinking, watching his face change as she relayed the conversation word for word. "An inquiry," he said when she'd finished, his voice gone flat and dangerous in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Into my household, over a woman who saved my daughter's life and put this family back together with her own 2 hands." "It doesn't matter what I've done," Eliza said. "Not to people like Verna. It matters what the law says, and the law doesn't say anything about a woman living in a man's house with no marriage, no blood tie, no legal claim at all. She's right about that much, even if she's wrong about everything else. Then we fix what the law says. But I'm not finished. He leaned forward, and there was something in his face now that she hadn't seen since the night of Mira's fever. A fierce, focused intensity, a man deciding in real time exactly what he was willing to fight for. I should have done this weeks ago, months ago, maybe, if I'm honest about how long I felt it. I was waiting for some right moment, some perfect time to ask you proper, the way a man's supposed to ask. I don't think there is a right moment. I think there's just now, and now is when somebody's trying to take apart everything we've built. And I am not going to sit here and let that happen because I was too slow to say what I should have said a long time ago. But what are you saying? I'm saying marry me. It came out rough, unpolished, nothing like the careful proposals Eliza had read about in the few novels she'd owned before her father sold off most of her belongings along with her. Not because some county inquiry is forcing my hand, though God knows that's part of it now. Marry me because I love you. Because somewhere between you sitting up all night with Mira and you teaching Caroline that grief doesn't have to mean control, and you giving Davy somewhere to put his anger that doesn't end in him hurting himself or somebody else, somewhere in all of that, I stopped thinking of you as the woman I bought for $1 and started thinking of you as the only thing standing between this family and falling apart all over again. I love you, Eliza. I should have said it before now. I'm saying it now. For a long moment, Eliza couldn't speak at all, the weight of it landing somewhere deep in her chest, tangled up with relief and fear, and something fiercer than either of those, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like genuinely being wanted rather than merely being useful. You don't have to marry me to keep the children safe, she said finally, because some old, careful part of her needed to be certain, needed to hear it without the inquiry hanging over both their heads. There might be other ways to satisfy a county officer. You don't have to do this just because Verna's forced the issue. I know that, Bo said. That's exactly why I'm telling you I love you first, before I ask you to marry me. So you know the marrying part isn't the whole reason. It's just the reason that finally made me say the other part out loud. Eliza set down her coffee, hands no longer trembling, and reached across the table to take his hand, the same way she had on the porch weeks earlier. Except this time there was nothing uncertain in the gesture at all. Then yes, she said. Yes, Bo Thatcher. I'll marry you. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for longer than just that conversation. And for a moment something in his careful, weathered face simply broke open with relief and happiness in equal measure. And he came around the table and pulled her up out of her chair and into his arms, and they stood there in the dim kitchen, holding on to each other, while outside the house the night settled in deep and quiet over a ranch that had, against every reasonable expectation, found its way back to something whole. But the joy of it was tempered, even in that moment, by the knowledge of what still lay ahead, an inquiry that wouldn't simply dissolve because two people had finally admitted what they felt for each other, a legal process that would need to be navigated carefully, and a woman who had already shown she was willing to use whatever cruelty necessary to tear down what Eliza had spent months building. It won't be simple, Bo said quietly, still holding her, his chin resting against the top of her head. A wedding takes time to arrange proper. The inquiry might not wait for that. Verna's the kind to push as hard and fast as she can, just to watch it hurt. Then we move as fast as we're able, Eliza said. I've survived worse than a hard woman with a grudge and a complaint filed with the county. I'm not about to let her take this family apart now, not after everything it took to put it back together. They stood there a while longer, neither quite ready to let go, both of them aware that the morning would bring its own urgent business. Word to send to the preacher in town, papers to be drawn up, a county officer to be answered before Verna's complaint could do any real damage. But for that one quiet hour in the kitchen, with the children asleep upstairs, and the future still uncertain but no longer faced alone, it was enough simply to hold on to each other and let the warmth of the decision settle into the cold, frightened places that the day's news had carved out in both of them. The investigation, when it finally arrived in earnest a few days later, would test everything they'd built far more severely than either of them yet understood. Official letters, a visiting officer with sharp questions and sharper suspicion, and the very real possibility that the family Eliza had fought so hard to become part of could still, even now, be taken apart by forces entirely outside her control. The letter from the county arrived 4 days later, carried out by a rider who handed it over with the particular grim formality of a man who knew he was delivering bad news and had no interest in softening it. Bo read it standing in the yard, jaw tightening with every line, and when he finally looked up, his face had gone the color of old ash. "They're sending an officer," he said, "man named Pratt, coming Thursday to assess the household. Verna's complaint names you specifically. Says you've got no legal standing, no blood relation to the children, and a reputation that calls your judgment into question." He crumpled the paper slightly in his fist before catching himself and smoothing it back out, like even his anger knew enough to be careful with something that might matter in front of an officer. Says if the household's found unfit, the children could be placed under county guardianship until a suitable arrangement is made. "Placed where?" Eliza said, though she already knew the answer would be bad, because there was no good answer to a question like that. "Don't know. Don't want to know. Not going to happen." Bo folded the letter and shoved it into his coat pocket like he could contain the threat of it by simply containing the paper. "We've got 4 days. We get married before Thursday. It changes everything Pratt's coming out here to ask about. 4 days isn't enough time to arrange a proper wedding." "It's enough time to arrange a real one," Bo said. "Preacher in town, a license from the county clerk, a handful of witnesses. Don't need more than that. Don't need lace and flowers to make it count. Just need it legal and done before Thursday." The children took the news the way children take most enormous things, sideways, in fragments, processing it through the particular logic of their own ages. Caroline, when Bo told them all together at supper that night, went very still for a moment, fork frozen halfway to her mouth, and then asked, with the careful precision of a girl who needed the facts laid out plainly before she could let herself feel anything about them, "So we're not in trouble? The county can't take us?" "Not if we're married before that man arrives," Bo said. "That's the whole of it." "Then you should have married her already," Davy said, with the blunt logic of a 10-year-old who saw no reason for adults to take so long over things that seemed obvious to him. "Everybody already knew you two were sweet on each other. Tobias and Sam had bets going on it for weeks." "We did not," Tobias said. At the exact moment Sam said, "We absolutely did," and the two of them dissolved into an argument over whose memory of the wager was more accurate, which at least had the effect of breaking the tension at the table into something closer to ordinary chaos. Mira, quieter than her brothers but no less direct in her own way, simply looked at Eliza for a long moment and asked, "Will you still be Eliza? Or do you have to be somebody different now?" "I'll still be Eliza," Eliza said, "just with a different name attached to the end of it. The person doesn't change just because the paperwork does." Mira seemed to accept this answer with her usual gravity, nodding once, and went back to her supper, though Eliza noticed her glancing up periodically through the rest of the meal with an expression that looked almost like quiet, proprietary satisfaction, as though she had personally decided, some time ago, that this was exactly how things were supposed to turn out, and was simply pleased to see the world finally catching up to her judgment. They rode into town together the next morning, leaving the children in Caroline's reluctant but capable charge, and Eliza spent the ride trying to settle the storm in her own chest, the strange collision of joy and dread that came with planning a wedding under the shadow of a county inquiry. She had imagined marriage, in the rare moments she'd allowed herself to imagine it at all since Daniel's death, as something slow and considered, not something assembled in a hurry to outrun a bureaucrat's deadline. But she had also learned over the past months that the things worth keeping rarely arrived on a convenient schedule, and that waiting for the perfect circumstances was its own kind of slow surrender. The county clerk, a tired man named Osgood, who clearly processed marriage licenses and land disputes with roughly the same level of enthusiasm, raised an eyebrow at the rushed nature of the request, but asked no further questions once Bo explained briefly and without elaboration that there was an inquiry pending and they intended to be married before it arrived. "Seen this before," Osgood said, stamping the paperwork without much ceremony. "Folks rushing a license to head off some complaint or another, not my business why. Long as the paperwork's clean, the county don't care about your reasons." He slid the license across the counter. "Congratulations, I suppose, given the circumstances." "Given the circumstances," Bo agreed dryly, and Eliza found herself almost laughing despite everything, because there was something darkly funny about receiving congratulations sandwiched between bureaucratic indifference and the looming threat of losing everything she'd built. The preacher, a soft-spoken older man named Reverend Cole, who Eliza had met only twice before, once at Margaret's funeral, which he had also presided over, a fact that gave the whole arrangement a strange, circling quality she tried not to dwell on too long, agreed readily enough once Beau laid out the circumstances, and seemed, if anything, faintly amused by the urgency of it all. "Love rarely waits for convenient timing," he said, signing the necessary papers in his small, cluttered study at the back of the church, the smell of old paper and candle wax thick in the air around them. "I've married couples after 3 days' courtship and watched them outlast couples who waited 3 years for the perfect circumstance. There's no formula to it, much as folks like to pretend otherwise. Wednesday afternoon suit you? Gives you 1 full day to spare before your Thursday visitor." "Wednesday's fine," Beau said. Reverend Cole looked between them for a moment, setting down his pen, his expression softening into something more personal than the brisk practicality he'd shown moments before. "I buried Margaret not 2 years past," he said. "Stood in that very pulpit and watched this whole family near come apart at the seams with grief. I won't pretend it doesn't do my heart some good, seeing the two of you sitting here now, even under these particular circumstances. Margaret would have wanted her children happy again, whatever shape that happiness took. I believe that much without any doubt at all." It was a small thing, a few sentences from an old preacher who had buried half the town's grief at one point or another, but it landed in Eliza's chest with unexpected weight. Another small, unsolicited blessing added to the strange collection she'd been accumulating since the day $1 had changed hands over her head on an auction platform. It was, Eliza thought, riding back toward the ranch with the marriage license folded carefully in her bag. A strange thing to plan a wedding as a defensive maneuver and still feel, underneath all the practical urgency, something genuinely and uncomplicatedly happy stirring in her chest. She had spent so many months believing herself unworthy of being chosen for anything but practicality that she had to keep reminding herself, as the ranch came back into view, that what was happening now was not merely strategy. It was also somehow, despite everything, the wedding she'd quietly stopped believing she deserved. Wednesday arrived cool and clear, the kind of crisp autumn morning that seemed almost deliberately kind given everything riding on it. Caroline had spent the previous evening fussing over what Eliza ought to wear, finally settling on Eliza's one good dress, a soft blue that had survived the auction and every indignity since, pressed and brushed until it looked almost new. She had also, without being asked, spent an hour the night before carefully unpicking and re-sewing the hem where it had frayed slightly, working by lamplight at the kitchen table with a concentration that reminded Eliza, achingly, of the way Caroline had once described her mother's sewing: patient, exacting, refusing to let an imperfection stand if there was time enough to fix it. "You don't have to do that tonight," Eliza had said, watching the girl's careful stitches. "I want to," Caroline said, not looking up. "You're going to stand up in front of the whole family tomorrow. I want it to be right." Mira had picked a small handful of the last wildflowers from the edge of the field that same evening, tied them with a bit of ribbon she'd found in her mother's old sewing basket, the same basket Davy had once grieved over, now repurposed for something gentler, and presented them the following morning with the kind of solemn ceremony that suggested she understood, better than most 6-year-olds could, exactly how much this day mattered. "For luck," Mira said, handing over the flowers. "I don't think I need luck," Eliza said, crouching down to her level. "But I'll take them anyway, because they're beautiful, and because you picked them." "Tobias wanted to give you a frog instead," Mira added, with the perfectly flat delivery of a child reporting facts without judgment. "I told him that was a bad idea." "It was a very bad idea," Eliza agreed, fighting back a laugh. "And I'm grateful you talked him out of it." The twins, for their part, had spent the morning locked in fierce debate over who got to stand closer to their father during the ceremony, a negotiation that ended only when Beau threatened, with admirable patience given the circumstances, to have them both stand at the very back if they couldn't settle it themselves. Davy had disappeared for nearly an hour before the ceremony and returned with his hair slicked down with water in an obvious, doomed attempt to look respectable, which earned him merciless teasing from his brothers and a quiet, approving nod from his father that seemed to make the teasing entirely worth it. The ceremony itself was small, exactly as Beau had promised. No lace, no fuss, just Reverend Cole standing on the porch with his worn black book, Beau in his one good coat with his hair combed flat in a way that made the twins snicker, until Caroline silenced them with a look sharp enough to cut wood. And the 5 children gathered close, witnesses to something that none of them, not so very long ago, would have believed they wanted to see happen. A handful of neighbors had come too, word having traveled the particular way news travels in small farming communities, faster than anyone intends and usually a little distorted along the way. Eliza recognized a few faces from church, from the mercantile, people who had stood in that same crowd at the auction months earlier and watched her be valued at nothing, now standing on Beau's porch with expressions that ranged from genuine warmth to careful, curious neutrality, the kind reserved for stories that had clearly traveled further than the truth of them. Eliza walked the short distance from the porch steps to where Beau stood waiting and found herself thinking, absurdly, of the auction platform. The same kind of public moment, the same sense of every eye in the vicinity fixed on her, except that everything else about it was entirely reversed. Then, she had stood in front of strangers being valued at nothing. Now she stood in front of people who had become, against every reasonable expectation, her family, and the only thing being decided was how completely she belonged to them. "You ready?" Beau murmured as she reached him. "I've been ready longer than I let myself admit," Eliza said. The vows were simple, the kind exchanged by people who had already proven in the hardest possible ways what those words actually meant before ever saying them out loud. Reverend Cole's voice carried easy and warm over the small gathering, the familiar old phrases, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, landing with particular weight given how recently sickness had nearly taken one of them from this very family. "Beau Thatcher," Reverend Cole said, "do you take this woman, Eliza, to be your lawful wife, to love and protect, in good times and hard ones, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Beau said, and his voice didn't shake at all, steady and certain in a way that struck Eliza harder than any flowery declaration could have. "I've meant it for a while now, glad to finally say it where it counts." "And Eliza," Reverend Cole continued, turning to her, "do you take this man, Beau, to be your lawful husband, to love and stand beside in good times and hard ones, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Eliza said, and found to her own quiet surprise that her eyes had gone wet without her quite noticing it happen. "I do, completely and gladly." When Reverend Cole finally pronounced them married, Caroline was openly crying, not bothering to hide it the way she once might have, the tears running freely down her face while she clapped along with the small gathered crowd. The twins were grinning at each other like they'd personally engineered the whole event, already counting it as a victory in whatever ongoing wager they'd apparently been running. Davy was trying very hard to look unaffected and failing entirely, swiping at his eyes with the back of his sleeve and pretending it was an itch. Mira stood very still and very solemn, holding tight to her father's coat sleeve, watching the moment with the same careful, absorbing attention she gave everything that mattered to her. And when Beau finally leaned down and kissed Eliza, brief and gentle, the small crowd on the porch erupted into genuine applause, and even a few of the neutrally curious neighbors found themselves smiling despite their earlier reservations. There was no grand feast afterward, no dancing, just a simple supper that Eliza had prepared the night before, eaten together at the same table where she had once struggled to get 5 grieving children to sit through a single meal without chaos breaking out. A few of the kinder neighbor women had brought dishes of their own, a pie, a basket of cornbread, a jar of preserves, small, unprompted gestures of welcome that meant more to Eliza than she quite knew how to express, given how recently this same community had stood by and watched her be auctioned off like livestock without a single voice raised in protest. Now they sat together easily, the conversation loud and overlapping and entirely ordinary, and Eliza thought that this unremarkable, noisy, completely alive dinner table was worth more than any of the lace or flowers she might have once imagined for a wedding day. Officer Pratt arrived Thursday morning precisely as promised, a thin, precise man with a ledger book and the unhurried manner of someone who took genuine pleasure in being thorough. He walked the property with Beau first, Ask careful questions about the household's finances and arrangements, the state of the cattle, the condition of the barn and fences, before moving inside to inspect the children's rooms, the kitchen, the state of their clothing, and the small slate boards Caroline used to help her younger siblings with their letters in the evenings. "You've got a schoolroom set up," Pratt observed, glancing at the slate boards stacked neatly on a shelf, the small collection of borrowed primers Eliza had gathered from neighbors and the church over the past months. "Caroline does most of the teaching for the younger ones," Eliza said. "Nearest schoolhouse is too far for daily travel, especially come winter. We make do as best we can." "And you, Mrs. Thatcher? Your own schooling?" "Through my 12th year. My mother saw to it I could read and figure sums before she passed. I've tried to pass that along." Pratt made a note, his expression giving nothing away, and continued his survey of the house with the same careful, methodical attention, pausing at one point to examine the small sewing basket sitting on a shelf in the front room, the same basket that had once held Margaret's unfinished work, the needle and thread long since put to use, the basket itself now simply part of the household's ordinary furniture rather than a wound nobody dared touch. Mrs. Crandall's complaint stated that the children were being raised by an unmarried woman with no legal standing, Pratt said, finally settling in the front room with his ledger open, looking between Bo and Eliza with the careful neutrality of a man who had clearly heard exaggerated complaints before and wasn't yet sure which category this one fell into. "That complaint's out of date," Bo said, and produced the marriage certificate from his coat pocket, the ink barely dry on it. "We were married yesterday afternoon. Reverend Cole at the church in town. County Clerk Osgood drew up the license proper. You're welcome to confirm both." Pratt examined the document with a raised eyebrow that suggested he understood exactly what kind of urgency had produced a wedding one day before a scheduled inquiry, but he made no comment on it beyond noting the date in his ledger with a small dry scratch of his pencil. "Convenient timing," he said. "Convenient or not, it's legal," Bo said, an edge creeping into his voice despite his evident effort to keep it level. "We'd have married regardless. The inquiry just gave us a reason not to wait. And the children's welfare prior to this," Pratt continued, unbothered, turning to Eliza. "Mrs. Crandall's complaint raised questions about your reputation, the circumstances of how you came to this household." Eliza had braced herself for this question the entire ride home from town 2 days earlier, had turned over a dozen different answers in her mind, and found, when the moment actually arrived, that the truth was the only answer that made any sense at all. "I was sold at auction for $1, she said plainly, meeting Pratt's eyes without flinching. "My father did it, declared me barren and useless after my husband died, and nobody else in that crowd thought I was worth even that much. Bo bought me because he needed help and I needed somewhere to be. That's the truth of how this started, Officer Pratt, and I'm not ashamed of it because I didn't choose the circumstances that put me on that platform. What I chose was everything that happened after." "And what happened after?" Pratt said, pencil ready. She told him, then, plainly and without embellishment, what had happened after. The long weeks of earning the children's trust one small offering at a time. The chaos of that first breakfast and the slow, grinding work of turning 5 grieving, hostile children into something resembling a family again. She told him about Caroline's birthday cake and the way the girl had finally let her walls down over a crooked bit of frosting. She told him more haltingly about Davy and the sewing basket, about the particular grief of a half-finished piece of mending that had cracked something open in a boy too proud to cry where anyone could see. She told him about Sam's button, wrapped in a handkerchief, offered as a small, solemn act of trust. And she told him, her voice catching only slightly, about the night Mira's fever nearly took her, and the long hours spent fighting for a child that wasn't hers by blood, but had become hers in every other way that mattered. "The doctor told us it could go either way," Eliza said. "Said all we could do was keep her comfortable and wait. I didn't sleep that whole night. Couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. By morning, the fever broke, and I think something in this whole household broke open with it, in a good way. That's not the kind of thing a woman does for a job, Officer Pratt. That's the kind of thing you do for family." Caroline, listening from the doorway where she'd been hovering with the deliberate casualness of a girl who absolutely did not want to be caught eavesdropping, finally stepped forward without being asked, something Eliza hadn't expected and could see, from the careful set of the girl's jaw, had cost her considerable nerve. "She sat up with Mira the whole night," Caroline said, looking directly at Pratt with none of her earlier wariness toward strangers. "Didn't sleep at all. The doctor said it could go either way, and she just didn't stop. Not for 1 second. My own mother's been gone the better part of 2 years now, and I never once, in all that time, felt like somebody in this house was fighting that hard to keep the rest of us together. Until her." Davy, hovering just behind his sister, added more gruffly, his voice cracking slightly with an emotion he clearly hadn't planned on showing in front of a stranger. "She didn't have to stay after the auction. Anybody else would have just done the chores and kept to herself, collected her keep, and not bothered with the rest of it. She didn't do that. She made this place feel like a house again instead of just somewhere we were all stuck being sad together." Even the twins, who had been hovering in the hallway with rather less restraint than their older siblings, pushed forward at that point, Tobias speaking first with the breathless urgency of a boy who'd clearly been holding something in. "She got our chickens to actually lay right," he announced, as though this were the single most important piece of testimony available. "And she didn't tell on us when we caught that skunk, even though the whole house stank for a week, and Pa was plenty mad about it." "That's true," Sam confirmed solemnly. "She just made us clean it up ourselves and didn't even yell that much." Pratt's mouth twitched, very slightly, at this last piece of testimony, the closest thing to amusement he'd shown throughout the entire visit. But he recovered his composure quickly and looked finally to Mira, who had been standing quietly at the very back of the gathered children, watching everything with her usual careful attention. "And you," Pratt said, his voice gentling slightly for the youngest of them, "do you have anything you'd like to tell me?" Mira considered the question with her customary seriousness, looking up at the officer with her enormous dark eyes, and then said simply, "She stayed when I was sick, the whole night. I remember some of it, even with the fever. She kept telling me I was strong enough." A small pause. "I think she was right." Pratt looked between the children and the two adults for a long moment, his pencil still, his earlier careful neutrality giving way to something that looked, if Eliza wasn't mistaken, almost like reluctant respect. "I've seen a great many households in my work, Mrs. Thatcher," he said finally, using her new name with deliberate emphasis, "where the legal arrangements were entirely proper and the children were miserable beyond description, raised by relations who fulfilled every letter of the law and gave their wards nothing of actual warmth in return. I've seen far fewer where 5 children, none of them prompted, none of them coached beforehand so far as I can tell, stood up unasked to defend the person responsible for their care." He closed his ledger with a soft snap. "I'll be filing my report as closed, with no further action recommended. For what it's worth, whatever Mrs. Crandall's motivations were in filing this complaint, they don't appear to have had much to do with the children's actual welfare, and a good deal more to do with some grudge that's none of the county's business to entertain." "Thank you," Bo said, and there was real relief in it, the careful, controlled relief of a man who hadn't quite let himself believe the danger was past until hearing it confirmed out loud. "Don't thank me," Pratt said, gathering his things. "Thank your children. They made the case better than either of you could have." He paused at the door, looking back at the household one more time. 5 children, 2 parents, a home that had clearly been rebuilt out of something that had once been entirely broken, and added, with a rare flicker of something almost like warmth, "Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. and Mrs. Thatcher. Seems to me you've already proven the kind of household worth keeping together, paperwork or not." He left within the hour, and Eliza stood in the yard watching his wagon roll away down the same dirt road that had once carried Verna's cruelty toward this house, feeling something in her chest finally unclench after days of holding itself rigid against the threat of losing everything. The weeks that followed settled into a kind of peace Eliza had not let herself imagine was possible. Not on that auction platform, not in those first uncertain weeks of earning a house full of grieving children's trust, one careful offering at a time. The inquiry closed without further incident. Verna, predictably, made no further attempt at interference once it became clear the law had no interest in supporting her grudge, and eventually word reached them, secondhand through town gossip, that she had moved on to making someone else's life difficult, which struck Eliza as entirely consistent with everything she knew about the woman, and which she found, to her own mild surprise, she could think about without much bitterness at all. There was something almost freeing in realizing that Verna's cruelty had cost her nothing in the end, except the satisfaction of having tried. The ranch, through that winter and into the following spring, became something it had not been since before Margaret's death. Not merely functional, but genuinely alive. Caroline took on more responsibility around the house without ever losing the warmth she'd slowly allowed herself to show, eventually becoming, in her own quiet way, something like a second set of hands Eliza could rely on completely. She took to keeping a small notebook of her own, recipes and small household tricks Eliza taught her, careful notes in a steady, improving hand. And more than once Eliza caught her practicing stitches on scraps of cloth with the same focused intensity she'd once brought only to controlling her surroundings. Except now the control had become something closer to craft, something she took genuine pride in rather than clung to out of fear. Davy's temper softened as the months passed. Not disappearing entirely, he remained, at his core, a boy who felt things hard and fast, but learning, slowly, that there were better places to put that feeling than slammed doors and dead snakes thrown at his brothers. He took to working alongside his father more and more as he grew, the two of them developing the easy, mostly wordless companionship of men who understood each other through shared labor rather than long conversation. And Eliza noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that he'd started bringing in the firewood every evening without being asked at all, a small habit that had become, over time, entirely his own, rather than something extracted from him through argument. The twins grew somehow, both wilder and more capable at once, their chaos increasingly channeled into genuine usefulness around the ranch, though the chicken coop never did entirely recover its dignity, and there remained, for years afterward, a standing family joke about exactly how many escaped snakes a household could reasonably be expected to tolerate before someone finally put a stop to it. Tobias developed, somewhat unexpectedly, a genuine talent for tracking and reading animal sign, something Bo took seriously enough to start teaching him properly, while Sam gravitated toward the practical mechanics of the ranch, fixing fences, mending tools, anything with moving parts that could be understood and improved. And Mira spoke more every season, her silence breaking open gradually like ice thawing on a slow river, until by the following summer she had become, against all early expectation, one of the chattiest of the five, full of questions about everything from why bread rose to why the stars moved across the sky through the seasons, and Eliza answered every single one she could, and made up satisfying answers for the ones she couldn't, and never once made the girl feel foolish for asking. Bo, for his part, settled into the marriage with the same steady, unshowy devotion he brought to everything else in his life. He was not a man given to grand romantic gestures, and Eliza had stopped expecting them somewhere along the way, finding instead that she preferred the quieter proof of his love, the way he always saved her the good chair by the stove on cold evenings, the way he still, even after a year, looked faintly amazed every time he caught sight of her across a room, like he hadn't entirely gotten used to the fact that she'd stayed. He took to leaving small practical gifts where she'd find them. A tool he'd noticed she needed mended properly, a bolt of fabric from town when he happened to see one in a color he thought she'd favor, never with any fanfare, just left where she'd come across it, his own quiet language for things he still found difficult to say outright. "You ever think about it?" he asked her one evening, nearly a year after the auction, as they sat together on the same porch step where he'd first told her he loved her, the same stars wheeling overhead. "How close we came to none of this happening. If somebody else had bid that day, if the fever had gone different, if Pratt had believed Verna instead of believing 5 children standing up for you." "I think about it sometimes," Eliza admitted. "I try not to dwell on it too long. It does something strange to a person, imagining all the ways their whole life might have gone differently over things as small as a single dollar or a single fever breaking one way instead of another." "What do you take from it when you do think about it?" Eliza considered the question seriously, watching the last of the daylight fade gold and then gray over the fields that had become, over the course of a single difficult, transformative year, the only home she had ever truly wanted to keep. "I think," she said slowly, "that nobody gets to decide what you're worth just by looking at you for a minute on a platform or reading a complaint somebody filed out of spite. Worth isn't something other people get to hand you or take away. It's something you build, every single day, in all the small, unglamorous ways nobody's watching closely enough to notice. Staying when it would be easier to leave, fighting for somebody through a long night when nobody would blame you for sleeping instead, earning trust one button, one cake, one quiet kindness at a time. That's the only kind of worth that actually holds up against people like Verna, or fathers who sell off their daughters for less than the price of cornmeal. The kind you build yourself, brick by brick, until nobody, not a crowd, not a county officer, not anybody, can tell you otherwise. Bo was quiet for a long moment, watching her with the same unguarded warmth that had become as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. Margaret used to say something similar, he said eventually. Not the same words, but the same idea. That a home's not a thing you're given. It's a thing you make, over and over, every single day, whether anybody's watching or not. She sounds like she knew what she was talking about. She did. So do you. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture that had become, over the past year, a kind of quiet anchor between them, and they sat together as the evening deepened into full dark, listening to the ordinary sounds of a household settling in for the night behind them. Caroline calling for the twins to wash up before bed, Davy's low laughter at something one of his brothers had said, Mira's small, steady voice asking one more question before sleep finally claimed her. Years passed the way years do on a working ranch, marked less by single dramatic events than by the slow accumulation of ordinary days, planting and harvest, sickness and recovery, small arguments and smaller reconciliations, birthdays that no longer carried the weight of grief they once had. Simply the easy, unremarkable joy of a family that had learned through hard practice how to be a family again. Caroline grew into a young woman with her mother's same exacting eye and her stepmother's same patient warmth, eventually marrying a steady young man from a neighboring property and starting a household of her own that she ran, by all accounts, with the same quiet competence she'd learned at Eliza's side. Davy grew tall and broad like his father, took on more and more of the ranch's daily operation as Bo's hands grew slower with age, and never once, in all the years that followed, forgot the woman who had once told him that being cold together wasn't a fair trade for an unfetched armload of wood. The twins, somewhat to everyone's surprise, both stayed close to the land, Tobias eventually working as a tracker and guide for travelers passing through the territory. Sam taking over much of the ranch's mechanical work, the two of them remaining, into adulthood, exactly as inseparable and exactly as prone to mischief as they'd been as boys, though their mischief had mellowed, mostly, into harmless teasing rather than actual chaos. And Mira, the quiet girl who had once gone nearly a year without speaking a full sentence, grew into the most talkative of all of them, eventually teaching at the very schoolhouse the family had once been too far from to attend regularly, determined, she said once, to make sure no child in her care ever felt as unseen as she once had, before a woman bought for $1 had decided to see her anyway. Years later, when the ranch had grown wider and more prosperous than either of them could have imagined on that first uncertain morning, when the children had grown into adults shaped as much by the love that found them after loss as by the grief itself, a small weathered sign appeared near the front fence, hand-painted by Davy as a gift on his father's birthday. The word simple and unadorned, not for sale. It wasn't meant as a joke exactly, though it always drew a knowing laugh from anyone who knew the family's history well enough to understand the reference. It was something closer to a quiet declaration, a small private monument to everything the family had survived and built since the day a single silver dollar had changed hands on an auction platform and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, turned into the foundation of an entire life. Because some things, once broken and chosen again with enough patience and enough stubborn daily devotion, simply cannot be priced. Not by a crowd that had once decided a woman wasn't worth $50. Not by a county officer with a ledger and a complaint to investigate. Not by anyone who measured a life's value in coins instead of in the slow, unglamorous work of staying. What Eliza had learned, standing on that auction platform with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on a feed store sign so she wouldn't have to watch herself being valued at nothing, was that worth was never really something other people could assign in the first place. It only ever looked that way from the outside, to people who'd never had to build it themselves out of nothing, one small kindness at a time, in a house full of strangers who slowly, stubbornly became family. Eliza Thatcher, once sold for a single dollar by her own father, had become, in the end, the very heart of a family that no longer measured worth in anything but presence, loyalty, and the kind of love that simply refused, no matter what came for it, to walk away. And perhaps that was the whole of the lesson this family had learned the hard way, through fever and grief, and a spiteful woman's complaint filed out of nothing but old resentment. That a life worth having was never the one handed to you easily, but the one you fought to keep, day after unremarkable day, long after anyone was still watching to see if you would.